Thank you so much for joining today. My name's Ilana Wachtel, and I'll be moderating the panel. And we're excited for the participants that we have, all experts in this field. I'm going to give you a quick bio of each. We've got Tim Judson, Executive Director of Nuclear Information for Resource Service, NIRS. Robert Freehling, Energy Policy Consultant. Daniel Hirsch, who's President of Committee to Bridge the Gap, a nuclear policy NGO, and he's retired director of the Program on Environmental and Nuclear Policy at UC Santa Cruz. Kevin Kamps, he is a radioactive waste specialist at Beyond Nuclear, and Linda Seeley is representing Mothers for Peace. Really excited to have you here. A couple housekeeping things. If you can hold your questions till the end, there is time at the end, or put them in the chat and I will monitor that chat. Just a quick note to the panelists, please try to keep your remarks to 7 or 8 minutes so we can stay on time. And to kick it off, I'm going to give a quick sort of timeline, give you the sort of state of play of Diablo, and other questions that fall into that category we can fill in at the end. So in 2016, right, PG&E decided not to renew the Nuclear Regulatory Commission license. And in 2018, the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, approved the plant's retirement. And the parties involved in this sort of protracted, difficult negotiation in this deal was PG&E, Friends of the Earth, the NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, Environment California, Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility, and labor unions, the IBEW, local and coalition California utility employees. So as a result, Unit 1 is scheduled for decommission November 2024 and Unit 2 in August 2025. And this was approved by the county in October 2021 to start the environmental review process, the decommissioning. Then we've got the Biden administration kind of coming into this mix, right? So part of their infrastructure bill through the Civil Nuclear Credit Program, the Biden administration is offering $6 billion in grants to support continued operation of particular plants. And those have to be financially struggling or operating in a deregulated energy market. Diablo does not qualify. So in late April, Governor Newsom kind of started spouting to the LA Times editorial board that he was open to keeping Diablo running past its closure dates and wanted to see if he could get some of that $6 billion to keep it running, but it doesn't qualify. So then in on May 23rd, 2022, Governor Newsom's administration sent a letter to the DOE, to Secretary Granholm, to ask the DOE to change these rules so that Diablo could qualify for some of the $6 billion. And in addition, asking if they could extend the deadline for such an application to July 5th, 2022. So that's kind of here we are. This is the lead up. And now I'm going to hand it over to Tim Judson to give you some background on renewable energy and how that fits in with Diablo. Tim.
Thanks, Ilana, and thanks everybody for being here today. As Ilana mentioned, we believe strongly that the Diablo Canyon doesn't actually qualify for this federal subsidy program that the governor is asking Secretary Granholm to apply to Diablo's extended operations. And in fact, as I'll lay out, doing so would be completely counterproductive to that program's ostensible purpose, which is not just to extend the operations of unprofitable nuclear power plants, which Diablo is not, but also but principally to prevent increases in greenhouse gas emissions resulting directly from the closure of those nuclear power plants. And The irony to this whole situation is that the reasons that Diablo is closing are actually to facilitate the growth of renewable energy and the achievement of California's emissions targets. And so, in fact, there are a number of things already in place that will guarantee that there will not be increases in greenhouse gas emissions in California arising from the closure of Diablo Canyon. And in fact, as my presentation and others will lay out, there's quite the opposite is actually the case. So I'm going to go ahead and share some slides sort of laying all of this out. Okay, so the fundamental question here is, why is Diablo Canyon closing? And as Alana laid out, this is arising from a joint proposal filed with the California Public Utilities Commission by PG&E in 2016 as a result of a settlement with labor unions and environmental groups to this effect. It resolved years of litigation and expensive regulatory interventions on all the parties' parts. And it includes a just transition for Diablo workers and local communities that is actually a national model for how to manage the closure of power plants and the economic transition for workers and communities. So PG&E's decision to close Diablo, was based on several decisions that it actually laid out, which I'll review. Diablo's generation was not going to be needed with load reductions in PG&E's service territory arising from a number of factors, including the formation of community aggregate renewable projects, energy efficiency and load reductions, and the expansion of rooftop solar statewide. They also found that Diablo, this is a key point actually, is that they found that Diablo's inflexible baseload generation would actually block the growth of renewables and cause transmission problems and higher costs on consumers going forward. And so that so the closure of Diablo Canyon was actually going to facilitate the expansion of renewables and the achievement of California's emissions goals at lower cost to consumers. Now, this is from PG&E's own proposal, that this will facilitate the orderly and reliable phase out of Diablo Canyon with greenhouse gas-free resources. And it laid out the various reasons that I just described in their presentation to the PUC. There's no need for inflexible baseload generation, that the evolution of the grid in California and elsewhere in the country with the expansion of renewables actually makes the particular type of generation that Diablo Canyon provides counterproductive to that transition. And then the declining need for Diablo Canyon generation. And in this chart, what PG&E laid out was two scenarios involving the growth of solar through community choice aggregation in its service territory and the decreasing amount of electricity generation that the PG&E was going to be responsible for providing through 2030. And in fact, this high CCA penetration scenario is the reality is tracking more with this, making Diablo's generation also superfluous on its system. So what's happened since then? This was in 2016 and to 2018 when this proposal was being laid out. And in fact, the CPUC has taken a number of actions and a number of different proceedings involving not just PG&E, but all the other utilities in the state to make sure that the requirement that Diablo's closure, as well as other goals for California's energy system, were met. And so there's a series of orders, that the CPUC has issued. There was one in 2019. And then others in subsequent years, basically laying out requirements for utilities across the state, including PG&E, to add a total of, by 2026, over 22,000 megawatts of new capacity from renewables and energy storage. This is more than 10 times the electricity generating capacity of Diablo Canyon and will result in much more renewable generation than the electricity that Diablo Canyon provides. So kind of going through this in different ways. So these CPUC orders for renewable energy and storage will result in, by the time Diablo Canyon closes in 2025, more than 20,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity and storage capacity in California. That's, again, almost 10 times as much as Diablo Canyon's. Cumulatively, the CPUC's orders for renewable energy and storage on a year-by-year basis are quite substantial, and they add up over time, with 2024 being one of the key years when most of this capacity is scheduled to come online, and it has to by CPUC order. And in various components, renewable energy generation themselves, energy storage projects, and then what are called hybrid renewable energy projects that incorporate energy storage into the system. Then there's the cumulative capacity in the years that we're talking about. And so we're looking at over 10,000 megawatts of renewable energy, over 10,000 megawatts just of storage capacity between now and 2026 that will have come online. In terms of annual generation provided by this energy storage, even just the energy storage projects alone by 2026 will produce more electricity for California's grid on an annual basis than Diablo Canyon does currently. This is sort of a tremendous statement itself, just of the gross amount of capacity that we're talking about. But in terms of the goal for Diablo to close without any increases in emissions, this chart is actually really telling. And this is just this is a chart of the renewable energy generation planned to come online from the year before Diablo Canyon closes to the year after Diablo Canyon closes. And this shows the annual change in Diablo Canyon's generation. This is the red stacks. The green stacks are the amount of generation provided in the first year of renewable energy projects coming online during this time frame, so that only you're seeing essentially the net increase in renewable energy generation in those years. And then the blue charts, the blue stacks are the net of that new and renewable generation versus the change in Diablo Canyon's output in these years. And so what you see is in each year, the amount of new renewables that are scheduled to be coming online in each of the years is greater than the change in Diablo Canyon's output as it's phased out. And so that in itself, really, makes it completely clear that, not only is California going to be replacing Diablo Canyon with a portfolio of resources that are greenhouse gas emission free, but that in fact that the total amount of that adds up to much more than Diablo Canyon's output. And so that really, that really should make it clear that under the express purposes of the DOE program, the Diablo Canyon can't qualify.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was wonderful. Thank you. So I'm going to move on to Robert. Robert Freehling is going to continue this conversation on energy distribution. Robert?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes,
okay.
Thank you so much.
So that gives the background of why the commission, the CPUC, decided to grant PG&E's request and the other parties to close Diablo Canyon by 2025. However, there's actually other components. The parts that Tim was talking about is the state's renewable portfolio standard program. That's what he was emphasizing. And that is the renewable energy that utilities and community choice aggregators, direct access providers are required by state law to buy. And that, of course, as he showed, was 10 times the capacity of Diablo Canyon. But that is only one fraction of the state's clean energy policies and programs. And I'd like to emphasize that. And in the graph that he showed, that was actually from PG&E's own testimony, of all the resources that are displacing Diablo Canyon, PG&E actually recognized these other resources. One of them is rooftop solar, which is not counted towards the state renewable portfolio standard program. This is not bought by utilities, it's bought by customers privately. Currently, there is online about 12,000 megawatts. In other words, almost 6 times the capacity of Diablo Canyon. that's been built by customers in California, with an additional over 1,000 megawatts being added every single year. And that's projected to continue for the next 10, 20 years, provided the state doesn't dismantle the policies that are required to support that, allowing customers to take full credit for the energy they generate on their bill. So another resource that exists is energy efficiency. And there's a law, SB 350, that was passed, I believe it was 2016. And it required that utilities and the state as a whole double what's called the additional energy efficiency that was beyond what was already expected to be accomplished. So the term was doubling additional achievable energy efficiency. There's actually 3 layers. There was a baseline efficiency, there's additional efficiency beyond that, and then there was the doubling of that SB 350 required. The Energy Commission did a report on how much efficiency that would save and produced a nice graph. I'm not going to try and struggle with the displays on here, but what I'll say is that adds, according to the Energy Commission's graph, about a Diablo Canyon worth of efficiency savings every 3 years between 2017 and 2029. So that'd be replacing Diablo Canyon over and over and over and over again every 3 years. That's just energy efficiency. So you have energy efficiency, you have the state's renewable energy program, you have rooftop solar, all doing this. And that's not even the extent of it. The state is also phasing out coal generation, delivering power to California, and is nearly completely phased out. The last coal plant delivering power to California is actually in Utah, and that will be retiring in 2025. And it would also erase about a Diablo Canyon worth of greenhouse gas savings. So the state on a whole has covered replacing the savings, whatever savings there is from Diablo Canyon in terms of greenhouse gases, many, many times over. So my question is, how many times do we have to replace Diablo Canyon before we as a state acknowledge that we've actually replaced it? 10, 20, 30 times? Because that's where we're headed, and we've already replaced it many times. We could have already retired it as far as our greenhouse gas trajectory is concerned. The story is unfortunately more complicated, which is that the community choice programs have left PG&E in droves. That nuclear power plant is designed to provide power for PG&E's own retail customers. And the majority of those customers have left for the community choice programs. I'm projecting that by next year, according to the state's population and forecasts and the number of communities that have said they're going to set up community choice programs, that by next year, about 15 million Californians will live in jurisdictions that have community choice programs. So the majority of customers have already left PG&E, and there's very little left. Now, in 2016, right at the beginning of this proceeding, PG&E knew this was going to happen, and they had already procured quite a lot of renewable energy. And they knew that they were losing so many customers that they were going to have to dump energy resources. And so they chose first to take the natural gas out of their mix from their own natural gas power plants. They continued to produce greenhouse gas emitting and power from their gas plants and selling it on the wholesale market, so it wouldn't count to their customers. It was kind of a bookkeeping trick to make it look like they had low greenhouse gas emissions. But they kept losing customers, so they started shedding renewable energy. And they shed about 40% of the renewable energy they had, dropping from 22,000 gigawatt hours. Now, mind you, Diablo Canyon produces on an average about 17,000 a year. So they had more renewable energy in their portfolio than the full value of Diablo Canyon. And they dropped about 10,000 gigawatt hours by 2020, which was about the minimum that they could do and still comply with state law. In the subsequent year, they started increasing it again. But the whole narrative that Diablo Canyon needs to be quote unquote replaced with renewable energy is exactly the opposite of what happened. They would have had 2/3 renewable energy today if they had kept the renewable energy they already had in 2016, and instead they dropped it as much as they could to about 1/3. So that's the history of it. And in that sense, one can say that they dropped this renewable energy in order to keep Diablo Canyon online and justified. In other words, rather than replacing Diablo Canyon with renewable energy, they replaced renewable energy with Diablo Canyon. That's the history. And do I have another minute or not?
I think let's leave it and then we'll come back at questions because I'm sure people will follow up if you can. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. So Linda, do you want to pick it up and go ahead and talk about the cooling?
Yes. I'm here representing San Luis Obispo Mothers for Peace, which had the organization that's been the legal intervener in matters around safety at Diablo Canyon ever since 1973, before the plant was built. And we continue to have many concerns about safety issues at Diablo Canyon. One, this isn't exactly a safety issue, but it's the major environmental concern other than, well, it's one of the major environmental concerns, which is the once-through cooling system at Diablo Canyon. Every day, every 24 hours, the once-through cooling system, which is essential to the operation of the plant because it keeps it from blowing up, it sucks in 2.5 billion gallons of water from the Pacific Ocean and circulates it through the plant and dumps it back out into the Pacific Ocean. And when it is dumped out, it's 19 degrees warmer than it was when it came in. In doing so, it also, as you can well imagine, everything that's in that water is sucked up through the plant, which includes trillions of eggs, marine from fish and other aquatic life, from krill, of the plankton, all of the essential nutrients for the ocean's waters are killed. And if you can think about that, going on 2.5 billion gallons of water every single day for 40 years, how much life has been destroyed by that plant. Other concerns that we have are around the economic issues of keeping the plant open, because during these past 6 years, or since 2016, since they signed the joint proposal, there's been a tremendous amount of deferred maintenance at Diablo Canyon, because it's just like having an old car. If you have an old 1983 Ford Falcon, and you find out that it needs new tires, you're probably not going to buy the best Michelin tires that are on the market. You're probably going to go buy a set of used tires because you know that those tires aren't going to be needed for that long. Well, the same thing has happened at Diablo Canyon with deferred maintenance, and also things called workarounds, which means that you have a problem. Say you have, I'll relate it to my home. I have a sink here and it's dripping. Well, I'm going to move from this house in 2 weeks. So maybe I wouldn't want to get a plumber to come in and fix my sink, but I might want to get my son-in-law to come over and put some tape on it till I move. And that's kind of what a workaround is. They've been doing those consistently since decided to shut down the plant. There's also one very, very serious issue, which is the embrittlement of the reactor vessel in Unit 1. Many years ago, the Unit 1 reactor vessel was declared as the third most embrittled reactor vessel by the NRC in the whole fleet. And now we've just gotten some new information today about that reactor vessel. and about the testing, how the testing of it has not been completed since 2002. So we have many, many safety concerns. That's about it. I'll turn it back to you, Ilana. You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. So that's a perfect segue into Daniel Hirsch, who will talk about another huge safety issue. Dan, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks. I don't think it's another safety issue. I think we have to remember what we're talking about here. Each of the Diablo Canyon reactors has, while operating, within it 15 billion curies of radioactivity. We measure permissible concentrations in picocuries. That's millionths of a millionth of a curie. Put differently, there is in each of those reactors 1,000 times the long-lived radioactivity of the Hiroshima bomb, and the spent fuel on site 10 times as much as that. If the cooling got disrupted, the fuel melted, you could have enough radioactive release, according to AEC and NRC studies, that you could wipe out a large portion of the state of California for generations. It's an immense amount of radioactivity. And the only way it is prevented from being released is if the cooling keeps working, if the safety systems keep operating, and most importantly, if there is no earthquake. David Brower, the late environmentalist, wants to find a nuclear reactor as a complex technological device for locating earthquake faults in California. Essentially, every time we built a reactor in California, we then discovered earthquake faults nearby. PG&E built Humboldt Bay, saying that the earthquake fault nearby wasn't active. A few years later, it was discovered to be active. They had to shut it down. Tried to build one at Bodega Bay, and as they dug the hole, a local geologist went down, a geologist for the local group, and found an active fault in the hole in which they were about to build a reactor. In Davenport, north of where I am in Santa Cruz, PG&E had to abandon a plan for a reactor because of a fault being discovered. But the situation for Diablo has turned out to be far more troubling. I'm going to show you a couple of slides, if I may, for a moment. So when the plant was designed, getting licensed, PG&E asserted that there were no active earthquake faults within 30 kilometers, none. And so they were, in their construction permit hearing, the local group asked to put on an afternoon's worth of testimony by a geologist that there were active faults nearby. PG&E objected. The licensing board voted 2-1 to not hear the testimony. Tom Pigford, head of nuclear engineering at UC Berkeley, dissented, saying, shouldn't we find out before we pour concrete if there are earthquake faults? But he was overruled. So they started to build the reactor, got the construction permit license in December of 1970, and a few months later, Hoskins and Griffiths, two geologists for the oil industry, found the Hosgri fault, just a few miles away from the reactor. PG&E initially denied it existed. When that failed, they then denied it was active. When that failed, they denied it could cause a large fault. And when that earthquake, when that failed, they eventually had to admit it. But by that time, 80% of the plant was built. And rather than abandon the plant or seriously upgrade it, they did a trivial hand waving of sharpening pencils to try to claim there would be less ground motion than the plant had originally been designed for. They created an exception for the Hosgri fault because it couldn't meet the design basis of the reactor as a whole. But then they said, don't worry, this Hosgri fault, I'm going to have to give me a second here. There's the Hosgri, coming very close to the reactors. They said, we're highly confident there are no other earthquake faults nearby. And so then a few years later, the San Luis Bay fault was discovered. And they said, don't worry, there won't be any more. And then the Los Osos fault was discovered, also near the reactors. And they said, don't worry, there won't be any more. And then in 2007, the Shoreline fault was discovered, which comes within 600 meters of the reactors, 300 meters from the intakes. And at this point, they were in real trouble. They claimed that the faults at least weren't connected. But in fact, they a few years ago had to admit that the Hosgri and Shoreline faults are connected. And when faults are connected, the longer the fault, the greater the ground motion that can be produced. They then said that the Hosgri and San Simeon faults weren't connected. Now they admit that the Hosgri, San Simeon, and the San Gregorio fault that goes north of me, it goes for hundreds of miles, are all connected. And so now they admit there could be a joint rupture along the Hosgri, San Simeon, San Gregorio fault zone, which runs from south of the reactors to north of San Francisco. So remember, they'd originally said there could not be any faults within 30 kilometers, and now we know that there are 4 and that they're interconnected. They can produce much more ground motion than the plant was designed for. And the whole problem is that earthquake could occur tomorrow. It could occur next week. It could occur in 3 years from now. And if it occurred and was large enough, which these faults are capable of producing, there could be enough ground motion that the coolant is disrupted. You could have pipes break, you could have pumps fail, you could have offsite power fail, so you can't run the pumps. And the fuel would begin to heat up, melt. The volatile radionuclides would be volatilized and be released into the air. You could have absolutely immense radioactive cloud over much of California falling out, with that radioactivity remaining then for generations. So there was a really good reason that Diablo was to be phased out. And that's because we can't count on there not being an earthquake with a ground motion greater than the plant is capable of withstanding, just like at Fukushima. Can't count on that not occurring. And so I want everyone to remember why Diablo is being phased out. It's because it contains an extraordinary amount of radioactivity in it that only stays inside if there's no accident, no terrorist event, no earthquake. And the longer it runs, the greater the risk that one of those things will happen before it is shut down. So this proposal by Governor Newsom, who helped negotiate the deal back in 2016, to break the deal and let the plant run far longer than it was licensed for, than it is capable of safely running, simply places huge numbers of people at great risk. And that's what's at stake here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I'm going to hand it over to Kevin Kamps. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to be reading from a prepared statement that I'd be happy to share if anyone's interested. So electricity is but a fleeting byproduct from atomic reactors. The actual product is forever deadly radioactive waste, a curse on all future generations. The risks include to our health, safety, security, environment, and pocketbooks. The DC Circuit Court of Appeals has recognized highly radioactive waste has, quote, the capacity to outlast human civilization as we know it, and the potential to devastate public health and the environment, end quote. The Government Accountability Office has described it as, quote, one of the most hazardous substances on Earth, end quote. It would be wise to stop making it at Diablo Canyon's twin reactors by 2025 at the latest. Irradiated nuclear fuel removed from Diablo's cores contains a myriad of hazardous radioactive isotopes. Each has a different half-life and hazardous persistence. These include radioactive substances such as cesium-137 with a 30-year half-life and 300-year hazardous persistence. There are long hazardous fission products such as iodine-129 with a 15 million year half-life and 150 million years of hazard. And there are actinides such as plutonium-239 with a 24,000 year half-life and 240,000 years of hazard. The most immediate and severe hazard is direct exposure to an irradiated assembly at a nearby distance in the absence of radiation shielding. A recently discharged irradiated assembly would give off more than 10,000 rems per hour in the form of external penetrating radiation. A person standing within 3 feet of this assembly would receive a lethal dose within minutes. For the next century, it would give off life-threatening doses at this distance. Long-term health damage from lower doses include cancers, other diseases, and lasting genetic damage, such as congenital abnormalities and chromosomal disorders, which could impact multiple generations. Radioactive hazards, if wastes escape their containment, will remain a threat downwind of storage, downstream of disposal, up the food chain, and down the generations for 1 million years. According to a 2016 analysis performed by Robert Alvarez Institute for Policy Studies, from 1986 to 2015, Diablo generated more than 1,300 metric tons of irradiated fuel. It's contained in nearly 3,000 assemblies, holding almost 775,000 rods. These rods contained nearly 500 million curies, which is 1.83 times 10 to the 19th becquerels of intermediate and long-lived radioactive elements. Diablo's 2 indoor wet storage pools contained about 5 times the amount of irradiated fuel than in both the operating reactor cores combined. There were 34 dry casks at Diablo in 2016, which held about half of the site's irradiated fuel. The structural integrity of these Holtec casks has long been challenged by industry and NRC whistleblowers due to widespread quality assurance violations. A decade ago, nearly 2/3 of the irradiated fuel at Diablo was high burnup. More than half was stored in the pools, while about 1/4 was stored with lower burnup fuel in dry casks. Diablo could use much higher burnup fuel if operations continue past 2025. Higher burnup fuel is thermally hotter and significantly more radioactive than lower burnup fuel, exacerbating the handling, storage, transport, and disposal risks. Of course, operations since 2016 have increased the amount of highly radioactive waste stored at Diablo by about 40 metric tons per year. Extended operations past 2025 would compound these mounting problems. This boils down to a monstrous level of risk, as from earthquakes, extreme weather, accidents, or attack at Diablo's pools and/or dry casks for decades to come. Regarding irradiated fuel management and operations costs, PG&E estimated a decade ago, if both reactors closed for good by 2025, at the end of their current 40-year licenses, there would be $477 million of M&L costs related to irradiated fuel. PG&E assumed the Department of Energy would begin accepting irradiated fuel for disposal beginning in 2024, and that all would be removed between the year 2033 and finally gone by 2055. This assumption was incorrect. And per the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, DOE cannot accept title for irradiated fuel until a permanent geologic disposal repository is operating. If granted a 20-year operating license extension by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, PG&E estimates Diablo would generate more than 2,000 additional irradiated fuel assemblies from 2025 to 2045. This would require nearly 70 more dry casks. The additional capital and loading expense would be about $173 million. But DOE has reported the first geologic repository cannot open before 2048. Shipments for disposal would not start till a decade later and would not conclude until 2090. The total capital and M&O costs at Diablo would be about $190 million more than if irradiated fuel generation had ended in 2025. And NRC has reported that a repository might not open until 2084. Complete removal of irradiated fuel would take until the year 2117. This would mean an additional 62 years of M&O costs, including more than $350 million in additional costs due to irradiated fuel generated after the year 2025. Of course, the public is forced to pay such added costs, whether in the form of damage awards coming from the US Treasury for DOE's partial breach of contract regarding waste removal, or as ratepayer surcharges for nuclear generated electricity, as with the Nuclear Waste Fund. Then there is the Hail Mary pass of consolidated interim storage. But the CIS facilities targeted at West Texas by interim storage partners, including Orano, and at New Mexico by Holtec, violate the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 as amended. Beyond Nuclear is challenging this at the Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit, the second highest court in the land. Natural Resources Defense Council recently submitted a compelling friend of the court brief supporting our arguments. But both CISFs are also in violation of the Atomic Energy Act on safety and security, as well as the National Environmental Policy Act on process and substance. Mothers for Peace is most thankfully a party to the Don't Waste Michigan and Others coalition. challenging both these consolidated interim storage facilities. We hope that, as with San Luis Obispo's Mothers versus NRC 15 years ago, which required NRC to address security risks at Diablo's dry cask storage, that the federal courts will uphold the law in our appeals against these CISFs. As shown by the city of Fort Worth, Texas, in its friend of the court brief in support of Don't Waste Michigan's arguments, the country is waking up once again to the mobile Chernobyl transportation risks, including proposed barge shipments from Diablo to Oxnard on the waters of the Pacific. Calling the Department of Energy's bluff on consent-based siting, the states of Texas and New Mexico have also filed lawsuits against these environmentally unjust consolidated interim storage facilities targeted at Latinx communities in the Permian Basin. Hardened on-site or near-site storage is the least worst interim alternative. Shut down Diablo by 2025 as planned. Thank you.
So hopefully we can do another one of these briefings down the road and perhaps tackle some of the new nuclear issues that are on the horizon. Again, thank you all very much. And we will hopefully do another one of these down the road and keep you all appraised of the deadline looming on July 5th for that application that Newsom could be submitting to the DOE.